Okay, so in this episode we're talking more about Mill and his harm principle. Well, this is the harm principle. The object of this essay is to assert one very simple principle is entitled to govern absolutely the dealings of society with the individual in the way of compulsion and control, whether the means used be physical force in the form of legal penalties or the moral coercion of public opinion. That principle is that the sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection. That the only purpose for which power can rightfully be exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. He cannot rightfully be compelled to do or forbear because it will be better for him to do so, because it will make him happier, because in the opinion of others to do so would be wise or even right. The only part of the conduct of anyone for which he is amenable to society is that which concerns others. In the part which merely concerns himself, his independence is of right absolute. Over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. Right, and that was one of the most famous passages in the history of political philosophy. And there's a lot said in it, so let's take it apart. The first thing to notice about it is it's not just about physical coercion. The principle doesn't only apply to physical coercion, it applies to all forms of control, including, as he puts it, the moral coercion of public opinion, of the kind, of the kinds that we were talking about in the last episode. A second point is that the principle applies not only to the state, it does apply to the state, but it doesn't apply only to the state, it applies to each and every individual. So the state is only allowed to exercise authority over us in accordance with the harm principle, but I'm allowed to exercise authority over you as well, only in accordance with the harm principle. The third point is that according to the principle, interference is justified only to prevent harm to other people. Now, it's the only if that's crucial here. It's not saying that the principle is not saying interference is justified if it prevents harm to others. It's saying interference is justified only if it prevents harm to others. There may be circumstances in which, let's say I harm somebody else, in which I should still be left alone. And the reason for that is that the interfering with me in these circumstances will itself be harmful, Mill thinks. And so he's saying, if I'm not interfering with anybody else, you can't interfere with me. If I am interfering with somebody else, maybe you can interfere with me. Okay, he would say, if I am interfering with somebody else, that in those circumstances, we then apply the principle of utility and work out whether interfering with me would create more utility than disutility. Okay, so that's the third point. Interference is justified only to prevent harm to others, only if I'm harming somebody else. It doesn't mean it's always justified if I'm harming somebody else. The fourth point is the strong anti-paternalism in the passage. You're not allowed to interfere with people for their own good. That's not acceptable. Now, this is supposed to apply, as Mill puts it, only to those in the maturity of their faculties. So there are exceptions to this. In particular, it doesn't apply to children. So you are entitled to violate the harm principle with respect to children, which we do, for example, when we require them to go to school against their will. Okay, and the fifth point is the point that Mill makes right at the end of the passage, where he makes it clear that what he's talking about here is individual sovereignty. Individuals are sovereign over themselves. And that's a very important notion for Mill. Okay, so the upshot of all of this, the key to understanding all of this is to see that interference is justified only to prevent harm to others. Okay, now what is harm, according to Mill? This is what he tells us. Mill says, as soon as any part of a person's conduct affects prejudicially the interests of others, society has jurisdiction over it, and the question whether the general welfare will or will not be promoted by interfering with it becomes open to discussion. So harm, on this definition, is a prejudicial effect on your interests. And remember how this works. If I'm not causing harm to others, you just have to leave me alone. Okay, you can't interfere with me. If I am causing harm to others, then you can think about interfering with me. You should interfere with me, however, only if doing so would promote utility. And it may well not promote utility, because interfering with me is itself a harm, right? And so there is disutility of interfering with me, so that has to be put into the calculation. Okay, now there's an important distinction here that Mill is relying on between what we might call interference and persuasion. So interfering with me would be, for example, physically preventing me from doing something, or putting so much pressure on me that it becomes incredibly difficult for me to do so. I might be ostracized by my society or so on. But this must be distinguished from persuasion. So, for example, reasoning with me, giving me arguments as to why I should change my mind or change my course of action. Mill thinks persuasion is perfectly okay. In fact, persuasion is to be encouraged, right? So if I think that you're doing something that's wrong, but you're not harming others, Mill thinks it's perfectly okay for me to try and persuade you to change what you're doing. I argue with you. I give you reasons why you should do something different. All that's fine. What I can't do is interfere with you. I can't coerce you. I can't arrest you. I can't pull out a gun and prevent you that way. I can't bring undue social pressure on you. Okay, because you're not harming other people, at the end of the day, you're sovereign. So I can't do anything that would undermine your sovereignty of yourself, but trying to persuade you doesn't undermine your sovereignty of yourself. It just gets you to think about whether what you're doing ought to change. And you get to make up your own mind. And that's the crucial thing here, I think. It's persuasion if what I do leaves you free to make up your own mind, to make your own decision, where it's a kind of compulsion or interference, in the sense that Mill is using the term, if what I do means that I get you to change your course of action without you really changing your mind. So I put so much pressure on you that you feel compelled to change what you're doing, like what happened with the Dixie Chicks. They felt compelled to apologize for their stance on the Iraq War, and it wasn't as if they just suddenly decided that the war was a good thing. They just thought, well, we just can't live our lives anymore unless we apologize, so we'll apologize. They felt compelled to do so, forced into doing so. Okay, another point is that Mill thinks you should, when you have to interfere, you should interfere as close to the harm as possible. So imagine a case of this kind. There's a protest, against some government policy or whatever. There's a protest that happens, and a person at this protest gives a speech, okay, and in part of the speech incites a riot, and that causes the riot to occur, and then there's harm as a result of the riot. Now, you are entitled to prevent the harm from occurring, but you want to interfere as close to the harm as possible. So if you can prevent the riot while allowing the speech to go ahead, you do that. If you can't do that and you have to prevent the speech from going ahead, you just try and prevent the bit of the speech that led to the incitement of the riot. If you can't do that, then maybe you'll have to prevent the speech. But you only prevent the protest if it's the only way of preventing the riot, and then you have to be sure that the harm is minimised. So you try and interfere as close to the harm as you possibly can. Excuse me. So if it goes protest, speech, inciting riot, you try and interfere as far down this chain as possible. Why? Because doing so will interfere with freedom the least. Okay, now as we introduced last time, one of the key aspects of this view is its impact on freedom of thought and expression. And there's three key points to be made, or that Mill makes in this context. He says, first, if any opinion is compelled to silence, that opinion may, for aught we certainly know, be true. To deny this is to assume our own infallibility. And we talked about this a lot last time. So the idea is we might be completely convinced as a society that we're right and a particular person is wrong. But that doesn't give us, Mill says, license to shut that person up, because it's just possible that that person's right and we're wrong. And we have to accept, as he puts it in this passage, our own fallibility, that we're not infallible. It's just possible, however unlikely, that we might be wrong and the person who we're trying to censor might be right. So we should let them speak. The second point, secondly, though the silenced opinion be an error, it may, and very commonly does, contain a portion of truth. And since the general or prevailing opinion on any subject is rarely or never the whole truth, it is only by the collision of adverse opinions that the remainder of the truth has any chance of being supplied. Okay, so it's quite possible that although we're basically right, or mostly right, or at least half right, there is truth in the position that we're trying to censor. Even if it isn't completely right, even if a lot of it's wrong, there may nevertheless be important truth there, and it's important for us to keep that in mind. Thirdly, even if the received opinion be not only true, but the whole truth, unless it is suffered to be, and actually is vigorously and earnestly contested, it will, by most of those who receive it, be held in the manner of a prejudice, with little comprehension or feeling of its rational grounds. And not only this, but fourthly, the meaning of the doctrine itself will be in danger of being lost or enfeebled and deprived of its vital effect on the character and conduct, the dogma becoming a mere formal profession, inefficacious for good, but cumbering the ground and preventing the growth of any real and heartfelt conviction from reason or personal experience. So part of what Mill's saying here is it's actually important, particularly in the realm of morals and policy and so on. It's actually important that there are false views out there, because if there weren't false views out there, we might believe the truth, but we wouldn't know why we believed it. It would just be a kind of prejudice that we have, just a sort of an unquestioned idea that's just floating around, and perhaps we picked up from our upbringing from our parents or whatever. But we would never really understand why it was true. Right? We would never understand the rational basis for it. And so it's important to allow people to debate even the views that we hold very deeply in a very cherished way, because only in that way will we understand why the things are true. And again, for what it's worth, I think Mill's right about this, and this is very important. I don't think the attempt to suppress views that we regard as false today is at all healthy. And there are two aspects of this in particular that would worry Mill today. One is what we might call the force of political correctness. And as I tried to show last time, the political correctness comes from both sides of the political divide. There's right-wing political correctness and left-wing political correctness. So being opposed to the war in Iraq was completely unacceptable. It was politically incorrect to be opposed to the war in Iraq in conservative communities in the United States during that period. And it's politically incorrect amongst, sort of, I suppose you would call, liberal communities in New Zealand to raise questions about whether the Prime Minister should have children while in office and so on. Okay, the politically correctness fires both ways. Right, it comes from the right and it comes from the left. And the other side of this is that there is a kind of that the backlash against political correctness is just as harmful as the political correctness itself. And that is, today, if you want to defeat a view, it's often enough just to label it as politically correct. So you just go, oh, that's just political correctness, right? And that's it. If you say that, then it's like you don't have to provide any reasons against it. If you just say, oh, it's political correct, that's just political correctness, right? Then that's it. You can just ignore the view, right? That seems to be the idea. You don't have to argue against it at all. You just label it with political correctness, and that's enough just to dismiss it. And all of this, Mill would say, is very bad news, because what we ought to be doing is actually reasoning, arguing for the views that we're promoting, rather than simply, shouting at people, you must believe this, you must not believe that, or just dismissing it on the basis of some label like political correctness. Now let's look at some problems with Mill's theory. One problem surrounds the question, what is a harm? I think it has to be said that Mill just doesn't give a proper definition of this. He does say, as we saw in a slide earlier, he does say that to harm someone is to prejudicially affect their interests. But that's far too broad a definition of harm, in part because we have interests in other people, right? So I'm interested in I have interests in how other people behave. And if we're going to allow that, then the whole idea of the harm principle is going to collapse. Because if I can say that you're doing something to yourself harms me because I have an interest in you not doing it, I'd prefer it if you didn't, I don't know, have your your headphones too loud because it's damaging your hearing, and it just upsets me to think that people are damaging their hearing, right? If I can say that that's a harm, I'm harmed by you listening to music too loud on your headphones that I can't even hear myself, well, then the harm principle is going to come to nothing, right? So we need to narrow the definition of harm much further than Mill allows. But we can't do it, it seems to me, simply by stipulating that people have only interests in themselves, because that's patently untrue. I think it's clear that, for example, parents have an interest in the well-being of their children. I mean, just think about it this way: if you really wanted to harm me, one of the worst things that you could do is injure my children. One of the most effective ways of getting at me would be through my children. So you can't deny that you can't claim that people have only interests in themselves. That's not plausible. People do have interests in other people, and those interests can be extremely important. Okay, let's just take some other examples. In On Liberty, Mill opposes the traditional enforcement of restriction on business activity during the Sabbath on grounds that the activity does not cause harm to others. So in New Zealand's case, I suppose when I was a child, we went through this, when it used to be the case that shops were shut on Sundays and for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons was religious. And Mill was opposed to this on the ground that opening on Sundays didn't cause harm to anybody, and so it should be allowed. But he says, in this discussion, he says, to quote him, traditionalists have a belief that God not only abominates the act of the misbeliever, but will not hold us guiltless if we leave him unmolested. Now, what that seems to indicate is, what he's saying is that the people who do believe in banning business activity on a Sunday believe that if they don't try and enforce that ban, they will be punished in the afterlife. Now, I would have thought that being punished in the afterlife is a harm, right? And so they believe, rightly or wrongly, right, they believe that they are going to be harmed unless they oppose trading on the Sabbath. So now Mill wants to say there's no harm here, but by his own account, it looks as if the people believe that there is harm. And so what are we going to do about this? Okay, so similarly, Mill maintains that indecency should be prohibited. So laws against, say, public nakedness or whatever should be, that those laws are okay. It's okay to prohibit indecency, but he doesn't really explain why indecency is harmful. And he maintains that parents should be required to see that their children are educated. So parents should be forced to make sure that their children are educated, but he doesn't explain why the lack of education is a harm. Now, notice we can all agree that education is a benefit, right? But there's a difference between not being provided with a benefit and being harmed. Okay, so we might think that children need to go to school because education is a benefit that they need, but that's quite different from saying that if they don't get education, they will be harmed. So on the face of it, Mill argues that children should be required to go to school, and parents should be required to ensure that their children attend school. That kind of compulsion is permissible, but he doesn't explain why there's any harm here. So what I'm really saying in general, in total, is that Mill's theory trades on a definition of harm that it doesn't supply. Okay, it needs a definition of harm. He seems to implicitly use it all the time in his discussions, but he never actually supplies a proper definition of harm. Now, Mill might respond to this by saying that it's wrong to think that the notion of harm is contestable. That one of the things that we can dispute as a society is what counts as a harm and what doesn't. That's one of the things we can debate, and we should be debating it. And I think that's fine. That would be a pretty good reply, but you'd expect more from Mill than this. You'd expect some kind of proper analysis of what a harm is, and him to provide some way of distinguishing harm from other kinds of interferences that we don't think are significant. But there's just nothing in Mill. The harm is so important to his concept. It is, after all, called the harm principle. Right, we really need a proper account of harm, and he just doesn't provide one, and that's a pretty significant problem with his theory, in my view. Another problem with Mill's theory is that there is an inbuilt conservatism in his harm principle that might not be apparent at first glance, and this may or may not end up bothering you, but the key thing to see is it's there, even though Mill may not have intended it to be there. It turns out to be there. And the conservatism comes from this. If harm is the deprivation of what I have, right? Harm is the deprivation of something that I have. So taking away something that I have, whether it's health or liberty or possessions or whatever it is. If harm is taking away something that I have, then it just turns out that the harm principle will naturally favour the status quo. Right, so whatever I have in society now, if you introduce the harm principle, right, I get protected with what I have. Okay, so if you impose the harm principle on a society where one person has all the wealth and no one else has anything, then the harm principle will serve to preserve the inequality that exists in that society. Because if I'm the one wealthy person in my society, you impose the harm principle, you can't redistribute my wealth because that would harm me. So there's a sort of inbuilt conservatism in the principle, because harm is taking from me what I already have in some sense. Well, the harm principle therefore preserves the position from which we begin. So the harm principle seems to presuppose entitlements that really need to be justified, but on their own terms. So we're talking about a society where I have everything and everyone else has nothing. Right, bang, we introduce the harm principle, then you can't redistribute my wealth to anybody. Well, what we really need, right, to justify applying the harm principle to a society like that is some justification for why I should have everything in the first place. Right? And if we can't find that, right, then how can the harm principle really prevent others from requiring me to redistribute wealth in that society? So you're likely to be keen on the harm principle if you think the status quo is just. I mean, if you like the status quo, if you think the status quo is basically okay, then you'll be quite keen on the harm principle. But if you think that the status quo is unjust, if you think, for example, there's far too much inequality in society, you probably won't be so keen on the harm principle, because if you introduce the harm principle, then it will make dealing with that inequality much more difficult, if not straight out impossible. So you're likely to be keen on the harm principle if you think everything's okay, nothing needs to change, but you won't be keen on the harm principle if you think society is in need of reform. And that's something ironic, really, because we've seen, as we'll see again, utilitarianism go through 180 degrees. In the hands of Bentham, it was a reformist idea. Bentham was a social reformer, and he introduced utilitarianism as a way of bringing about major social reform. In Mill's hands, however, it flips, and it becomes a rather conservative principle that defends the status quo, serves to defend the status quo, even if it doesn't actually justify the status quo. Okay, so it goes from radical to conservative, and we're going to see that in the next theory to neoclassical economics that we're going to look at in the next episode.